Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, of course, U.S. History Edition. We are going to begin talking about the time period of growth and expansion. So certainly we've just finished up the War of 1812, and in this chapter we're kind of going to be making our way towards the Jackson presidency. So the image that you guys are looking at right now, these are the Lowell girls. We're going to talk about the role and the building up of industry, but also certainly in this time period, a new economic opportunity for women. So it's a great introduction to where we are. For my students, make sure you follow along with your guided notes. And then for my other listeners, I hope that you find this informative and hopefully a little engaging. All right. We, of course, are going to start off with our learning objective here. All right, I can identify how new technology changed the way things were made. And in particular, we're going to talk about the factory system today, but also we'll get into things certainly like interchangeable parts. So the invention of tools and machinery are going to make production of goods easier, they're going to be faster, and that's going to lead to the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution begins in Britain and then spreads throughout Europe and then makes its way to places like the United States a little bit later. So this is certainly an international trend that has already existed, but this is a revolution that's going to change the way people work. Remember that we've been talking about in the United States this desire to have an agrarian society, one based on agriculture. But you're going to see that begin to change a little bit, and you're going to see that people are going to have more than one opportunity to make a living for themselves in the United States. So you're certainly going to see the growth of industry, and where you're going to particularly see it to begin with is in New England, perfect location for the Industrial Revolution in the United States. We're going to talk about why here in just a second. But that industrial growth is going to begin in New England, and then it's going to spread to other parts of the country. And by the time we get to the 1870s, the nation's largest industrial cities are going to begin to grow. In fact, we've got Moses Brown, who wrote a letter to Samuel Slater in 1789, who said, "If thou canst do this thing, I invite thee to come to Rhode Island and have the credit of introducing cotton manufacture into America." And so certainly you're going to see that textiles are going to start booming in the United States. All right, so we're going to be looking at how this new technology is going to change the way things are made. And the geography is a big contributor to why this begins in New England and then eventually spreads throughout the United States. So again, the geography of New England is going to play a really important role. And we're going to kind of go through these step by step. So the first one is that farming was difficult in New England's poor soil. The soil of New England tends to be a little bit rocky, like the image you guys are looking at, and it tends to be a little less fertile. And so it's not ideal for growing crops. And so certainly with that being the case, people needed to look into other ways to make a living. And so this is a big part of the reason for this expansion in New England is the fact that growing crops was so difficult. The second thing is that there's abundance of rivers and streams for water power. One of the things we're going to see during this time period is that people are going to utilize water, not only, for example, for water mills, but later on we're going to see them utilize it in the steam engines. So certainly like the image you guys are looking at for milling grains, but also they're going to play a really important role in early factories as a power source. And so just to kind of give you guys an example of a textile mill, and again, textiles are going to use cotton to make things like clothing, for example. This is a Lowell system. We're going to talk about Lowell a little bit more here in a little bit. But a typical Lowell textile mill usually, had anywhere from about 1,830 housed, so people working there, to about 4,500 spindles. In 1830, they housed about 1,500 or 4,500 spindles, 120 power looms, and more than 200 employees under one roof. So they certainly would utilize that water mill throughout the process. The first steps of the textile are to clean the raw cotton, turn them into crude yarn, which is again the building block for making textiles. And the spinning process is then going to transform the yarn into thread. The weaving stages are kind of your third look here. They're the ones who are going to make and take it from that coarse thread and certainly turn it into um, fabrics. And then that fourth step is for dyeing. And typically that was vegetable dyes. And then again, that's getting it ready to send out. The third reason that the geography of New England is perfect is that the other power sources are there. And the resources such as coal and then of course iron later on are very close. And coal is going to be again another important source of fuel. So New England, again, the location is perfect between the rivers to run the machinery, but also certainly the growth of the coal industry is going to be really important for powering a bunch of technology in the future, including the railways. So again, you're starting to build on resources for a whole new wave of not only how people make a living, but how things are made in the country like the United States. And again, a large amount of our coal is found in this area of the United States. So we're looking at Virginia, West Virginia in particular, and then of course, Western Pennsylvania. Our fourth reason is this area has many ports. And so certainly when you are making things, you've got to be able to distribute them. And so ports are going to play a really important role in distributing the goods that are being made. So whether it's the textile mills or later on things like steel, having the ability to spread and trade those goods is very essential for industry. So again, kind of recapping as far as geography, it's certainly the poor soil, it's the rivers and streams for water power, it's the coal and iron deposits, again, for resources and also for power in the case of coal, and then of course, the ports to be able to ship. All right, we can't talk about the growth of industry and not talk about Mr. Eli Whitney. So in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which very quickly took the process of removing seeds from the cotton fiber and essentially made it much quicker and less expensive. And this is actually one of the things you were starting to see is that the need for slaves was starting to decrease prior to this time period. And actually, an unintended consequence of the cotton gin is that because cotton could be cleaned so more quickly, farmers wanted to harvest and grow more cotton, and they needed more slaves in order to make that process happen. So sometimes with good, like the example of increased production of cotton, also comes the bad, which is the increased need for, in particular, African slaves in the United States. Whitney also used interchangeable parts, which allowed the production of a variety of different goods on a much larger scale. So, for example, you buy a rifle and you go to a gunsmith who makes it from start to finish. If something breaks on your rifle, you got to go back to that gunsmith who then will need to repair it. But with the idea of interchangeable parts is that you could now fix those things that were wrong with your rifle. And also you can make more rifles more quickly because all the parts are uniform. They don't have to be uniquely created by one person. And so that's going to make things cheaper as well for not only to produce, but for people to buy. So again, those are those uniform pieces that can be made in large quantities to replace other identical pieces. Again, cheaper for people. People are going to be able to um, afford things a little bit more. And again, it's going to open up a whole new industry for producing those interchangeable parts. So in 1970, with all of this change going on, Congress passed a law to patent, which is a document that gives an inventor essentially the right or the sole legal right to produce an invention for a period of time. And then after that period of time is over, people can use it. And certainly patents are still something in American history that people tend to argue over and debate quite frequently. And of course, this time period, Francis Cabot Lowell is going to become very important. He's going to help to fill up the factory system. And It's again where manufacturing steps are brought together in place to increase efficiency. So a lot like the mill that we looked at, that factory-like system, along with interchangeable parts that Eli Whitney brought in, he's going to take that and take it even a step further to increase production and, of course, um, drive down the cost of making goods as well. So when we look at the United States as a whole, the economic system that we have is called capitalism, in which individuals put their capital or their money for investment into a business. And then the hope is that as they put that money in, that the business will succeed and it'll make a profit. And they'll be able to, in turn, receive some of that for their investment. So when we look at the elements of free enterprise, and again, this is the freedom of a business to operate competitively for profit, and again, with the idea that there's minimal government regulation. So the idea here, and certainly free enterprise also describes the economics of the United States. But the first element of it is certainly competition. Companies need to be able to compete against each other to make better products, to make them cheaper, just to have more people buy them. So that competition is necessary. They also have, of course, they need to be able to make a profit. They need to be able to pay their workers, but they need to be able to make money, put that money back into their company, or, of course, hold on to that wealth for themselves. Certainly, there needs to be private property, and so you can't be doing this on land that is owned by the public. It needs to be an industry that's controlled by individuals that own the factory, that own the land, so that that system can work. Again, you need that for a private business. And then you have to have economic freedom. You have to be able to, again, this kind of speaks to the government regulation, that you need to have some freedom. And again, what gets debated throughout a lot of history is how much freedom, how much regulation is there. But again, you have to have some economic freedom in order, of course, to stay competitive. Agriculture is going to expand during this time period, and certainly it remains the leading occupation for most Americans in the 1800s. But you are going to see that farms in the Northeast are going to tend to be smaller, and they're going to market more locally. So they're going to be selling mostly within the region. But that's different if you look at the more southern states. The plantation systems are taking place. And of course, with that comes the need for labor, and that was coming in the form typically of enslaved Africans. Again, were taken against their will and brought to work on this plantation system in order to help meet the increasing demands for cotton. And again, a lot of that southern cotton was making its way to northern factories. Farmers also are moving west. They're continuing to focusing on raising cash crops such as corn and wheat. And so certainly there is economic opportunity, but it looks different on where you live. If you're in the Northeast, you're certainly looking at perhaps more industrial opportunity. If you live in the South, you're looking for more agriculture. And in the West, you're probably looking for an opportunity for agriculture, but also maybe a fresh start. But above all, Americans are looking for economic independence, an opportunity to be able to carve out a living, maybe support a family, and maybe increase their own individual wealth. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap us up for today. I apologize for the technical difficulties this morning, but for my students, make sure you follow along with the guided notes. And for people listening, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for coming along. That's going to wrap us up, and thank you for tuning in to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History.